Hello, welcome to the realm of ideas is free to all. These are my kind of weekly ruminations about things pertaining to my work. I am an architectural researcher and draftsman and speculist. Speculist is a term that was coined by Julie Rower, and we've kind of come to understand it as those people who engage in the speculative endeavors, architecture, math, science, painting, drawing, anything where philosophy, theology, those kind of things where the realm of ideas is kind of tantamount to what you do. So anyway, this is episode 14. It's called The Aftermath. Last couple of weeks I've been speaking about my own personal development from my beginnings as a child up through my education. Last week we talked about my recent past architecture, which is everything from, I'd say, 1975 up to 1990. We talked previously about my from 1960 to 1975. So now we're going to go from 1990 to the present, which is a long period of time, but it's basically been the most fun and the most kind of individual. Just kind of to place me in terms of the things that we've talked about. Julie had asked me a question just before and said, like, do you think of the shape of these pieces? And I said, I kind of see this as a anthology. I think there's a lot of repetition. There's a lot of times where I retrace steps in order to kind of like put together a cohesive piece. So I kind of like feel as if I don't know if everything I say is consistent. So by kind of going through them, I start to realize not just the lacks of consistency in certain places, but also the kind of need for modifications. Whereas over the course of thinking, over time, certain things become modified, refined, changed, thrown out, etc. So anyway, the way these last three pieces were was we kind of talked about my first interest and intrigue into the realm of kind of speculative endeavors and introduction to Leonardo da Vinci as a small boy, and then kind of like the way in which that moved through the way in which I kind of developed my my thinking. So that was the way in which we kind of started that first one. From there, we went to the circumstance of education, my particular education, and where that kind of took me and how it led to certain things. We talked about the fact that there was a narrowing of the perspective. We talked about the first time when my initially there was a great deal of opportunity in the horizon for ideas and was vast. The horizon of ideas and imagination, the horizon of imagination was quite vast. So for me, the architect with the model of Leonardo meant that everything that could be imagined was the realm of architecture. So when I entered into architectural education, I was somewhat saddened and disheartened by the fact that it was much more limited in terms of the capacity of what the horizon held. So the horizon now suddenly shrank. Also, on top of that, there was another factor, which was the kind of like, kind of sycophantic fetish reality of the New York architectural kind of circumstance, which also limited its imaginative capacity. So the horizon was also dampened by a kind of a just sycophantism and kind of fetishism that kind of like, kind of limited a lot of possibilities. So that was kind of, we'll leave that at that. So as a result of in the end of my tenure as a teacher, I was offered an opportunity, which I spoke of briefly, to represent the United States at an international symposium on architectural education in the Soviet Union in 1990, which to me was like a real James Bond thing. There's a funny story that goes along with it, but actually kind of seemed like out of James Bond, and I lived to tell about it. Anyway, in the course of leading up to this, I kind of found that I was developing my ideas and was finding that I was kind of one of the things that was encouraging was I was finding some of the things that the interests that I was finding were people outside of my particular, field. I was finding at the time, interests, along the lines of musicians, artists, and a few scientists, mathematicians, but it really hadn't been, that large. But I found, as if I remember one time, think I was giving a talk, and someone said, Bruce, the talk's really well attended, but there's no one here from the architectural school. And I thought that was funny. I thought it was funny, and he didn't really necessarily think it was a good thing. I said, well, maybe, like most of the people in the room right now, given the departments they come from, are smarter than people in our department. So that's good. Anyway, so I think that was when I first kind of started talking about organic architecture, or kind of thinking about it. I remember kind of, giving a talk, and at the end of the talk, I talked about the idea that I expected in my lifetime, this is like 1988, 1999, that I would grow buildings rather than build them. And I remember kind of everyone looking at me as if I kind of had two heads and one of them was on fire. So yeah, it was kind of, it was like one of those things where there's certain lectures where you can tell the character by the way in which people respond. I never wanted, it was nice to get applause. Applause was always, kind of courteous. But the thing is, when the greatest lectures, the greatest talks I ever gave were the talks when I stopped. And there was this silence of like, like when you kind of have just been driven in a car at 150 miles an hour and you kind of pull over to a stop, there's that moment of kind of like catching your breath and kind of finding that, you kind of have to collect yourself. And then there's a kind of like applause, but there's that gap between that breathtaking whirlwind end to the ride and kind of finding yourself back. I find that I've experienced that in concerts. I'm mostly in kind of like concert chamber music circumstances. I remember it was probably last year we listened to the Brandenburg. There was a group that played. Was it the Complete Brandenburgs, right?
The Complete Brandenburgs. We saw it at Christmas.
It was like the second and the third, which are my favorite. Mm-hmm. Both of them left me in a kind of like state of like.
It was the Calidor string quartet.
Yes.
Yeah.
Brilliant stuff.
Their signatures.
Yes.
Yeah.
And
they're terrific.
They're terrific. Anyway, so the thing is that there is that sense where you kind of feel as if you leave people breathless, and I kind of enjoyed that. Anyway, so as a result of some of the things, for whatever reason, I remember a colleague had gone to the Soviet Union with a portfolio of some of my work. And then when they returned, a person asked me if I could introduce them to this person. I said, that person is me. It's like, oh no, that was a woman. It's like, no, yeah, I know who that woman was. That woman, was carrying a portfolio of my work. Anyway, she said, hey, I'm with this group that's traveling from the Soviet Union. We're doing an exchange. They did an exchange there. Now they're back here. Now can we, is it okay if I stay with you for a few days because we don't really have any money? And like, I said, yeah, fine. So anyway, this woman who I'll name because I don't know what her circumstances, Elena Chuchmelyova, who was the vice chairman of the Union of Soviet Architects. I did not know who she was at the time. And it was funny because she stayed with us for like 3 or 4 days. And I enjoyed her company because I was, teaching. I was in between going to the studio and coming back and working. It was a lot of fun. And she just kind of tagged along with me. And she said that she was a professor from the Soviet Union, said she was at the University in Leningrad. Anyway, that was not who she was. So we communicated through drawing because she didn't speak English. I didn't speak Russian. She spoke a little French. I spoke very little French. And any French that I spoke was probably better off not to be spoken because I was so bad at it.
You speak petit cerise.
It's true. Yeah. So anyway, as a result, we got along and she we spoke about work. And I remember she said, I need to see your studio in the university. So I took her there, and unbeknownst to me, she said, Bruce, I'd like you to come as the United States representative to this initial this was the first ever participation of this kind of graduation projects, kind of presentation and symposium. And I was like, what? And then she said, I'm Elena Chuchmalyova. I'm Vice President, Union Soviet Architects. I'd like you to come to the Soviet Union to represent the United States and speak about, your ideas about architecture, architectural education. And I was like, okay. Anyway, I thought this would be a perfect time. It was coming at the end of the year. I said, like, this would be a good time to kind of like, take my act on the road. So I remember this was in kind of middle of the semester, because I remember I got the actual envelope on I think the 2nd or 3rd of January for the next year. This was in, I guess it was in the fall. So the fall, she visited, made the announcement. I kind of told the school, I said, hey, next semester, my last semester, I'm basically going to kind of call it a day. So as a result, I'm off to the Soviet Union. I was always excited because the Soviet Union was our arch adversary. I mean, we were locked in the Cold War, and it was all these talks of like perestroika and glasnost and Gorbachev and all these things were happening. And again, now it's like the Berlin Wall comes down and the Soviet Union is kind of a different place. So the thing I remember was it was the time when we had conversations about things that we'd never thought about before. Now, one of the things I always remembered was I had played hockey, and I was a kind of fairly average hockey player, nothing special. But I remember I always followed the game, and I always loved the great games that took place between the Canadians and the Soviets. In fact, I remember 1987 was probably the Canada Cup Series, 1987, between the Soviets and Team Canada, was probably the greatest hockey I had ever seen in my life. It was, Wayne Gretzky at his prime with some of the best players with him from the Oilers, some of the players that they had from the kind of still remaining New York Islanders, and a lot of the kind of stars of the league. I think just about everyone who was on that team went to the Hall of Fame. And the Soviets had a comparable team. They didn't have Tretiak, he had retired, but at the same time, this was Fetisov and Larionov and Krutov and all these guys who were just, amazing, and a lot of those guys have, came to play in the NHL, and they went to the Hall of Fame too. So anyway, 1987 to 1990, I'm teaching. And I'm also keeping an eye on, hockey, because this was the thing where they were talking about the fact that, players were going to defect, and some players did. I think it was it McGillney? I think Alexander McGillney. And there was that things were actually going to be leaving the Soviet Union. Things were changing. So I was excited about meeting these people who were my adversary, who I've known about since I'm a little boy, who were going to basically kind of drop bombs on me and vaporize me. So when the opportunity comes to go to the Soviet Union, but anyway, I remember Elena had, because of who she was, this was the first time she had ever been outside of Moscow. So when she comes here, she had one wish: can you take me to the ocean? Since she was a little girl, she had never seen the ocean. So I remember we were going to go to Jones Beach at the time, because it was the only thing that we had resembling an ocean Puddle.
It's okay.
In Queens, Nassau, Long Island metropolitan area. So anyway, but before that, there was a hockey game on, and we're watching the hockey game, and Fetisov, who was the captain of the Soviet team, had been the captain of the Soviet team, was playing for the New Jersey Devils on TV. And she saw the name. She goes, "That's our captain." And I mean, that was like one of the things we had in common was our love of the game. And we talked about that series and how, incredibly important that series was for both of us. I mean, I remember it was summer. because it was a summer hockey tournament, but the chance, because of the NHL and the Soviet Union, all the things, it was hard to get a best on best, because the leagues came first. And again, at that time, there was still the Soviet national team, which won all the Olympics and all the world championships. So we went out to the ocean, and she wept in the sand, because it was like, I think we cried too, because it was one of these things that, like, I got the chance that someone who had been so generous and kind to me was someone who had something I could kind of grant her one of the wishes that she was looking for. So anyway, get on a plane, and it was kind of, I love the intrigue of the whole thing. So we get on the plane, and I was going to fly to Belgrade in Yugoslavia when it was still Yugoslavia, and then going there on an Aeroflot plane to Moscow. Now, what was interesting is Aeroflot didn't fly during the day. They only flew into Moscow at night because I'm assuming everyone who was going there from America was a spy, except me, which is kind of leading up to the story. So I get on this group of 7 people who's going to the Soviet Union. I looked at everyone else and said, like, these guys are all spies. It was pretty obvious. Like, oh, what do you do? Oh, I'm a photojournalist. Oh, I'm a finance guy, or I'm this. Like, I was like, y'all work for the CIA. It's clear. I mean, they know that. We know that. It's not. So anyway, we get over there, and we fly to Belgrade. We kind of have a stay over in Belgrade, and then we fly into Moscow at like 4:00 in the morning. And I could see these guys kind of all trying to take whatever they had, trying to kind of get any kind of view of, what the terrain was that they're flying over. What was funny was Aeroflot was still kind of getting accustomed to Westerners flying into the Soviet Union. So they were kind of like experimenting with smoking and non-smoking. I mean, whereas American, European flights had all gone to like no smoking, they were kind of trying it. So they had like this side of the plane was smoking, this side of the plane was non-smoking, which I thought, okay, they're experimenting, Then on another flight, I remember they had like even and odd aisles. Like the even aisles you could smoke, the odd aisles. So they weren't really getting the idea of not smoking. It was like, it's not that you could kind of segregate. It was the idea that you didn't want to be smoking, eating the air. So anyway, we get off the plane, middle of the night, go into an empty airport. Everyone there had guns and uniforms and medals. It seemed like they were medal obsessed. First thing I noticed was everyone was wearing medals of some sort. So I was like, so we get off the plane, we're standing there, and I see, it looked like I said, now it's starting to get into James Bond film part. So I get off the plane and I'm standing there, and there's these 2 guys who look like they're out of James Bond. They're like 6 foot tall, blue eyes, blonde hair. One of them they have the leather hat, they have leather coat, which of course I'm assuming means they have an AK underneath or whatever. And they're looking over at us, and we're looking over at them, and they're like, I don't know. We were kind of, I guess we were all waiting to be picked up by whoever it was picking at us. In their case, the KGB. In my case, I was waiting for Elena to come to get me, because she was the person I was supposed to meet at the airport. So anyway, as we're waiting there, all of a sudden, these 2 guys seem to be focusing on me. And I'm like, there's like all these CIA guys here. And I think there was one female spy too. And they're looking at me. And I'm like, oh, this is not good. And they're kind of like, then one guy kind of takes out a picture and he looks at it, or like notes or something. He looks at me, he's like looking at me. He's like, and the guy points, he's like, yeah, that's him. I was like, oh, this is not good. This is not good at all. Now I was there with my ex-wife, and it was, those things where like one person steps forward, everyone's, like stays in line. In this case, like they came over to me and they asked me, is like, like, you come with us. And everyone stepped back, including my wife. So my ex-wife and everyone else stepped back, allowed them to say like, come with us. And they were perfectly happy. All these other people were perfectly happy to let these people take me. And I thought, hey, my ex-wife was Bulgarian, so I don't know, she might've been a spy the whole time, but the other ones were, these, I'm thinking, you guys are CIA, I'm American, like, get me, I don't even have a weapon, I'm an architect. What can you got the wrong guy. Anyway, So they whisk me through the airport, one guy on either side, both of them like 6, 7, 8 foot tall, 250 pounds, all muscle. And I'm like, oh God, this is it. So we go out into the middle of the night, into the dark, and we go into the car. And this one guy just opens the door. He goes, get in. And there's another guy in the back seat. So I'm sitting and then he gets back in. Now, one thing I noticed was the cars weren't very big. And I'm sitting between 2 8-foot tall guys, and I'm just squashed in the middle. And I'm thinking, well, they're going to kill me in the car. They're going to take me to a dump site. Again, I'm dead. My life is over. So I'm thinking, this is the end. So we ride off into the night, and I'm thinking, who's going to help me? By the time anyone even notices that I'm gone, my body is kind of 2/3 to 3/4 decomposed.
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry. Scratch that
That's
detail.
grim.
No, I didn't die at all, Puddle. In fact, I didn't die once in the entire time in the Soviet Union.
Well, we couldn't have eaten pasta earlier tonight if you were dead.
I've heard it both ways. Anyway, so we go through the night. We're kind of driving through the thing, and I'm thinking like, wow, I mean, I never thought that it would end like this, but again, I'm like, who goes to the Soviet Union in 1990 as an American? But again, that's why Julie has the saying, pulling Bruce from the wreckage. And I'm saying like, it didn't seem like a bad idea at the time. So here we are, and this is going to be the end. So we finally kind of come to this blind alley, and we went by the KGB building, which ironically had a toy store in the ground floor. And no, it was true. And it was funny because
Were they explosive toys?
Probably. But what was funny was it was like most stores, there were no stores at the time. Yeah. So it was like, the idea that you would see a building and at the ground floor would have, stores. In Moscow, that wasn't the case. In Leningrad, that wasn't the case. There were no stores because there were no products. So the fact that there was a toy store staged by the KGB in their building was funny. Anyway, so we pulled down this blind alley and we stop, and I look up to this one window with the one light on, and it's one of those swinging bulbs on the thing, and I'm like, you guys got to be kidding me.
I've heard it, but I mean, it's always really funny.
No, it's true. So anyway, they're like, so the one guy turns around and he goes like, how was your trip? And I'm thinking, this may be the new, kind of friendly, we're getting to know our neighbor kind of thing. Before you kill the guy, you got to ask him if he's had a good flight, So now they like, get out, and they get me out. And there's one guy behind me, one guy, in front of me, and it's like they're just kind of staging me, and they're like, we walk into this building, and it was a back alley, so it wasn't even a front door. And I'm like, guys, why do you care where you kill me? And like, you might as well just, no one's gonna find me ever, And I'm thinking, who's gonna miss me? So we go up the stairs, no light, creaky things. Like I thought it was like an abandoned kind of black, site. We go up into it, and I'm like, walk into the door, and I'm like, and there's Elena, and she's like, oh, Bruce, like, oh, good to see you. She runs over and she kind of throws her arms around me, and I'm like, oh my God, I can't believe it's you. Well, I had no idea. And she's like, what's wrong? What's wrong? Now, of course, I'm white as a ghost. She goes, are you okay? You don't feel well? I said, have you ever seen James Bond? You know who James Bond is? And she had no idea. She goes, no. I said, like, oh, I'll tell you one day. I said, but not now. I just have to get my heart rate down, below 200. So, I mean, I just thought, and when I read her telling the story, she laughed, and I think she started to cry because she's laughing so hard. And I remember we were with her husband. He goes like, yes, we do that.
It's all Blofeld.
I know. So anyway, stayed in the Soviet Union, had a great time, but I realized that what my country had told me was completely a lie. This was a third world country with nuclear warheads. They had nothing. They absolutely were destitute beyond words. I bought a car for $15.
Very interesting.
I went to the Soviet Union with $500. Now, again, I was originally supposed to stay for a certain amount of time. I stayed for a lot longer, came home with $200. Now, some people can, and the thing is that there was nothing to buy, right? I mean, I remember going out with my students, and if I had $1 and I would go into a restaurant with 20 people, they would bring out everything they had, right? I mean, I had my students eat things that they had never eaten in their lives because American currency was that good. I could have was offered to buy a house for $50.
That would have been tempting.
Would have been. Now it'd be worth like $10 million.
Right,
But
you'd have
anyway,
a house.
I remember one time we were on the way to the university and the bus stopped. And like one of the Tatiana's the name for translator because there was always three Tatianas. And one spoke English, one spoke Russian, and the other one was there to report back to the other two to the KGB. So the bus stopped, and I thought, this isn't the way. Now the bus always went a different way. And another thing that was really funny was like I started collecting maps because you need maps to get around. Now I was never allowed to go anywhere by myself because I was an American, even though everybody said like, oh no, I'll go with you. And they said, no, you can't walk here. No, you. And there were people who were around who would say, with guns, it's like, you can't go down the street. Why do you want to go down the street? And I didn't ask. So I remember, we went out of the bus went out of service. I thought, well, the bus break down. These things had never been maintained in 145 years. So I thought, what is it? So I said, oh, newspaper. It's like, oh, great, a newspaper. That'd be great. What day is it? What week is it? What month is it? What year is it? And they said, no, not newspapers. Newspaper. So they had bundles of newspaper from the 16th, 17th, and 18th century, or wherever they got them from. I don't even think they were in Russian. But it was just the fact that there were bundles of twined newspaper. Now, I tell this story only because it's important that you realize this is what the reality was. So now we had newspaper. And what I realized was everyone bartered and everyone crafted and everyone was, that saying is like necessity is the mother of invention. These people had nothing. They made their own clothes. They made their own food. I mean, they made their own alcohol. I drank things that would not be legal.
It's amazing that you still have your hearing.
Amazing I can still have my sight. I mean, these people were the most ingenious, most resilient, most adaptable people the world had ever seen. I remember that one of the things the students said was, you're given 3 pieces of paper per project. Now, what that means is you got 3 pieces of 24 by 36 paper. That didn't mean that was for your presentation. That was for your presentation. That was for your model. And that was for your sketches. Wow. There was no paper. So anyway, so if you had paper, you traded with a guy who had bottle caps. If he had bottle caps, he traded with a guy who made labels. So everyone was doing barter with everyone else, and everyone had a racket. Everyone had a thing.
Tell a story about the pigeon.
Oh, yes. There was a guy.
That's great.
I ate pigeons. I probably ate rats. I ate anything that you could find. I remember like being, people would take you to your house and you're like, what's that? There was a guy who I was told and I saw who actually took coat hangers, electrical wire, and he made these devices to catch pigeons on the roof, the ledges of the windows. So he sold pigeons, and he would get this. No one had money, so it was all barter, but it was hysterical. And I realized that this was an incredibly ingenious group of people who simply did their best to adapt, not to die. I remember one time when we were riding on the train to Leningrad from Moscow, and everyone, of course, was drunk. And again, it's the middle of the night because we never traveled by day. And, this woman's, who said to me, there was nothing, they didn't fear the United States because there was nothing the United States could do to them that was any worse than what their government had done to themselves. And it terrified me because here I am, like in the middle of nowhere. It was never a place I felt comfortable. So in a way, I didn't really have anything to come home to, because at the same time, I was like, I didn't really want to really stay much longer. So when the opportunity came, I came back, and it was nice to kind of be out of there. But I did enjoy my time there. The students, the people I met were incredibly brilliant, ingenious, innovative. But unfortunately, because they'd been so sheltered, it was good and bad. They were sheltered because they didn't really know about what had happened in architecture in the rest of the world. But on the other hand, there was a tremendous amount of opportunity to think independently, which was something I think was very good for them. They weren't kind of tied down to a lot of these kind of like inertial kind of like things that had happened in architecture in the West. One of the things I did find was that in a lot of ways, architecture was a kind of family kind of tradition, and it was passed on generation to generation. That fathers taught daughters, and daughters taught granddaughters, and sons taught daughters, and sons taught son. And it was just passed on. And there was a guy who I'd met I actually enjoyed. His name was Kropatchev, and he'd started a school that kind of gave me the impetus for Imaginaria. So, as a result of coming back from Russia, I kind of like enjoyed that as a kind of like a last kind of like, kind of stepping out of, academia and kind of stepping into, having a job and then doing my work on the side. So I also felt it gave me the kind of indication that, the limitations that had been conscripted on me in New York and in the West were kind of like irrelevant. And now that I could kind of go back to what I felt was for me a truly valuable, beneficial thing. In teaching, some of my thesis studios had basically introduced Ortega's idea of the aesthetic metaphor, but I kind of started to investigate how that was more organic and natural. So that was something that started to kind of, kind of percolate in my head. I had come across this idea of a kind of an automatic kind of drawing. So what I started to do was kind of create what I kind of came to call organic design thinking, which was based on the idea that I really felt that once I came back, it was time to kind of start to rethink this architectural endeavor, more as a kind of like, there was enjoyment in teaching. I loved teaching. I loved my students. I never loved the politics of the academy. And I also didn't like the fact that one of the things that I see now, which was starting then, was, the professor, the provocative academy of, people being compelling and kind of being able to kind of like command the audience and their authority coming from the compelling nature of their argument became something that was not only no longer appreciated, it was basically attacked and censored. And all of a sudden now administrative positions were starting to dominate and take hold over the organic, healthy endeavor of professors being professors and kind of like thinking and acting and doing. And I found that a lot of professors were willing to be stooges for the administration in order to kind of like stabilize their positions, and enjoyed seeing the more talented genius types, individuals, be kind of like pushed aside and kind of ostracized and eventually eliminated. So for the most part, those were older professors who had been established that had this happen. But at the same time, I had kind of been this kind of new face with new ideas. So it was kind of something where it was like, you're no longer welcome here, given your attitude and your approach, even though that was the approach until 2 minutes before I got there. So I came in at a time when it was still, I could still kind of, I'd enjoyed it as a student. I got a chance to enjoy it as a professor, but could see the fact that like, if I had stayed, it would have been a very unrewarding, very stifling circumstance. And given the context, I felt I was better off on my own. I still stayed in contact with some professors who I met in some of the schools or around, but I kind of didn't really see that there was anything exciting for me to follow. So I kind of felt as if it was time to go off on my own. So Russia was like the launch pad. Now, again, this is now 1990. I'm born in, I'm 30 years old. And I'm looking at the fact that by this time I was supposed to be, on a space station. But because of the fact that, we had kind of harnessed all that energy and power for nefarious political and kind of like, backhanded things, we never really got to engage in that endeavor of exploration that was kind of promised us. So what happened was, you know, these ambitions that had started early on as a boy about flying, spaceships and things like that were now completely gone. In New York City in the 1980s was the wild, wild west. It was AIDS and crack and crime and death and squatters and all kinds of crazy stuff, but hardcore. The Bad Brains, and the New York hardcore scene, and that was kind of fun. But that died in 1983, 84, and remember kind of like feeling somewhat disenfranchised. Like I felt like that was, when Reagan got reelected in 84, it kind of like killed the kind of liberal spirit, and never really recovered. So 1990, I come back to New York City, and I decide like, it's time to do what makes sense to me. So what I did was I kind of thought about some of the ambitions that I had. I wanted to start my own school, like the Kropatchev School. I kind of remember telling all my friends, "Hey, man, we're going to do this and that." And I realized like my friends were like, "No, no, we're not going to do that. We don't." And then I kind of found it as if like they enjoyed appreciating my ability to elevate them but they were not going to contribute to something of mine. And then, I kind of, fortunately, it was only 5 years before I met Julie. I met Julie in 1995 on January 25th, and we've just celebrated our 30th birthday. So that really kind of like
Anniversary.
1990 to 1995 was a lot of turmoil, a lot of kind of like reevaluating my circumstance, finding where I belonged. One of the things that also transpired was that the architectural landscape, there was a kind of a kind of recession in 1988, which kind of basically kind of put a lot of people out of work. So I found that there was a lot of opportunity in construction for a person who had the ability to read drawings and kind of, in fact, my first job was as a layout guy. I remember talking to someone and saying I needed to get a job. And he said, "Well, do you want to do layout?" I said, "What's layout?" He goes, "Well, what happens is somebody takes the plans and they kind of like draw them on the floor so that we can lay our track for our studs." I said, like, "You pay someone to do that?" And he said, "We pay a lot to do that because like a lot of our guys can't read drawings, and like being able to kind of know that is a really valuable thing." So I remember went from, being an architect and kind of making like zero money to suddenly being offered, at the time, this is 1990, $30 an hour, which was a lot of money. And I'm like, man, no architect makes that. So I suddenly kind of doubled my salary pretty much by just kind of like deciding to be a layout guy, which I actually found was fun. Because one of the things I also remember was like, architects, especially the ones that we were trained, had absolutely no practical application skills and could not tell a right hand door from, I don't know, a fountain pen. I mean, it's like there was absolutely no technical ability available. And it's like, it just seemed as if the world of design had become so incredibly fetishized and inconsequential that, it was irrelevant. Remember one time going to a construction site and remember thinking, oh, I'm the architect. They'll be, completely in awe because I remember going there and the kind of giving the guy the drawings and he threw them on the table and he said, like, "Is that it?" I said, "Well, do you need me to look at it?" He goes like, "Would you know what you're looking at?" I remember thinking like, yeah, I was incredibly intimidated. And then I remember going back with the partner of the firm and he wanted to show his knowledge. And I remember they had a little wood shop because there were a lot of custom pieces that we're doing. And, he said like, "Well, I was looking at some of the measurements and I looked at some of the shop drawings." He goes, "Oh, the shop drawings." He goes, "We were having a great time laughing at that." And he said like, "Well, this piece for this rail has to be," it was some ridiculous thing. He went to like, it was like to the 32nd of an inch. And the guy goes, "I'll tell you what, do me a favor, Mr. Bossman Architect, go over to my table saw and cut me off a 32nd of an inch." And then he goes, that was just the end of the story, because he realized it's like, you're being a complete idiot, because there's nothing of consequence at a 32nd of an inch that we're going to basically do for you.
That's right.
And we would if there was actually a reason for it. And the architect, like, remember, he tried to kind of say something. He goes like, tell me the consequence of that 32nd of an inch, please. He goes, because if you can, then I'll do it. And this guy actually had been, he had worked on, he actually worked in the shop of the person who made furniture for Alvar Aalto. So he knew about bent wood, and he knew all about, he was not the guy you were going to tell about furniture, and you were not going to tell him about custom woodwork. And it was embarrassing. And I remember another time that I won't embarrass him, but there was a fairly prominent architect who I was working for, was doing some work for, and we went to, no, actually, I was the super on the job. And this was somebody who I'd been associated with from an affiliation with another, academic institution. And, he was going on about this thing about this guy who was the client, listening to his speech. And I remember he goes, Mario, shut the fuck up. I'm not one of your sycophantic fucking students. We've been here for 9 fucking months. Finish my fucking house and get the fuck out of here. Now, this was a guy who was a fairly recognized architect in the New York environment. I'm using a fake name. That was not who he was. But the reality was, this was a guy who was, typical, obnoxious, haughty guy. But it was partially because no one at that point was taking these people seriously. They were a little shrinking cult of personalities. And that bothered me, because I went into this thinking of the magnitude of a person like Frank Lloyd Wright, a person who was larger than life, a person who was a household name. So now I'm kind of given the fact that there's these people who nobody knows, and even each other, you would kind of like not really know. You listen to them, they didn't say anything of consequence. You were around them, they didn't say anything that kind of moved you. So I felt, okay, this is fine. We'll go off on our own. So going off on my own, we started to kind of come to understand that there were things that I felt, there were impulses I wanted to reconnect to. One of them was what I considered, an American impulse towards an organic architecture. And I mean, the term organic architecture had been in existence in the United States and had been talked about, in Chicago. And this was when I started to understand the difference between a democracy and a republic, and why America and its constitution created a very, very valuable circumstance for us. We are an incredibly diverse place. So when people say America, the things that America has in common is its difference. There's a Manhattan, there's a San Francisco, there's an Erie, Pennsylvania, there's an Omaha, Nebraska. There are cornfields, there are wheat fields, there are oil wells, right? There's forests. There's all kinds of diverse realities in this place. And one of the great things that I came to understand, because I don't know, for some reason I read the Constitution at the time, and I remember the Declaration of Independence, and maybe it was something coming back from Russia or whatever, because I said, watching the despair and the desperation of my friends there, it made me truly sad. They had become bitter, they had become jaded, they had become divisive. There was no cohesion. It was every man for himself. It was lonely. It was isolating. I mean, I was isolated because I was the only American there, but at the same time, I felt bad for my friends, because, my friends had this sense of like, we don't have family, we don't have relationships. If you had anyone who was close to you, they were kind of like more likely to be the kind of people who would turn on you because they knew where your vulnerabilities were. And as I kind of started to meet more Russians as they came over in the 1990s, I started to realize the incredible difference between us. I remember kind of like, a friend of mine, Ivan Fukinov, and he was like one of I think he wired Chernobyl, and I used to always make fun of him. I said, like, and he he was saying like, I can't believe you kind of like will say that about the president. I said like, well, that's the thing. It's like, I love the president. It's like, well, you just called him a fucking cocksucking dirtbag. I said like, well, just a matter. It's just a figure of speech. He's like, if you had said that in public in Russia, I was like, yeah, I know. I mean, but we have the ability to be hyperbolic and excessive. We don't mean it. We just say it out of frustration, but it kind of gets the point. Now, ironically, that's America Now. Is that kind of same thing? Is it like we have things like hate speech and misinformation and all these kind of bizarre things? Anyway, back to architecture. So, based on that concept, what I found was this universalism and this kind of hermeticism of a kind of organic, of an inorganic, urban kind of European 19th century architectural, maybe 20th century architectural idea was not the kind of thing that was going to actually grow in an authentic organic architecture. Because the idea was each place, each region had its own particular desires. And farmers were different than cowboys, and cowboys were different than stockbrokers, and stockbrokers were different than, you know, the military. And there was all this diversity, which was really not being appreciated with this kind of universal one size fits all kind of boutique approach to architectural fashion. And that's pretty much what it had become. So given that, I started to think about the fact that like there's a tremendous diversity in inorganic, in the organic aspects of life. So I started to investigate these things. And as I started to kind of open up into the organic design thinking, started thinking about processes to kind of take me away from this very stagnant thinking that had kind of like, you know, been with me. So in the course of like meeting Julie, one of the first things Julie said to me is like, you have to get over, you know, if you're going to make an organic architecture, you really need to kind of find a truly organic impulse.
Yes, it is.
And I think that was when things started to change. Now, again, in the course of this, right, after, you know, I had come to understand the necessity of being a draftsman. Now, being a draftsman, I talk about in the classic sense of Leonardo as a draftsman. I rediscovered that idea. And that was kind of where I found that that was the impulse of design. So that drawing was actually that illustration of the process. So now we're coming to start to formulate these ideas. We kind of understand the idea of criticism and its importance. We understand the idea of analysis and discernment, skepticism. And we start to understand the idea that there's a process more than an end result that's important. And now we need something that generates that, and that's drawing. So what happened was I found that in drawing, the idea was, and I'm still dissecting that and reducing that and kind of like distilling that down. I became fascinated with the overlay of kind of multiple orders and structures, which was something that was pretty much not the case in the current architectural systems. I mean, the idea of two systems simultaneously was somehow about as far as we could go. But I found as if the idea of kind of like the kind of overlaid multiple systems and orders like you would find in a forest was beyond, you know, the capabilities of what we were willing to do. Also, the kind of like luxury, hermetic isolation was not something that I kind of felt was part of that impulse. So, you know, back to Wright, Goff, Fuller, people like this. And that didn't mean I didn't also kind of enjoy some of the kind of like visionary impulses in Europe, you know, or in Japan, and start to understand that. But I mean, I think they had less of they were still, especially in Europe, more obsessed with the machine nature of architecture, which I think was, you know, it had its moments. But I think as we started to learn certain things, we started to kind of see that you know, kind of was limited. But it did have some really kind of like revolutionary impulses of like what could be thought about. But again, you know, I came from the idea of like rocket ships, and I wanted to be making things like that. So I started to kind of, you know, isolate these processes, and I kind of started to kind of think about, exercises to kind of bring myself to the point where I could start to generate these things. So drawing for me became an exercise. So becoming proficient as a draftsman, Julie and I found a tremendous resource. I mean, we'd started at the Cooper Union alumni drawing studio. Actually, Julie and I met at a drawing studio.
Yes, we did.
Yeah. And it was a great story. I think I'll tell it next time because we're kind of, this isn't going too long.
I don't think it's too
No,
long.
Puddle, I'm already at 50 minutes. I can't keep, I wanted to make these things 15 minutes. They're becoming an hour now.
Well,
So anyway, I'll make sure I talk about that next week because next week we're talking about, indicators of societal health. Good. I can work that in.
okay.
So, and then the other one after that is emotional attachments to ideas. Okay. So the idea was, these things were starting to illustrate an impulse of how to generate images, or what I call artifacts. And then artifacts would basically become these networks of structures that were interrelated. So at this point, I started to kind of like feel as if the people, God, I hate the allergy season. It's been spring for like two minutes here in New York. And already my eyes and my nose are itching. And it's also 20. That's right.
Really
Yeah, cool. Actually, it's like 3:50 in the morning here. So anyway, so what happens is now, I start to do these things, and I start to understand the idea that there needs to be an understanding of kind of a different terrain as well. So that was something that was also kind of like important to kind of like take all to understand. So as a result of kind of meeting people and kind of befriending a different group of people, that was when I kind of started to get interested in kind of formative structures, generative structures. And I remember kind of meeting Robert Lang in California and having a good conversation with him. And kind of we were doing a program with the University of California, San Diego. And that was really when I kind of found the desire to understand surfaces and membranes and scaffolds and substrates. And that was kind of something that kind of became really, really valuable. So that kind of gave me an insight into the fact that I looked at, though I had the three-dimensional capacity to kind of imagine and illustrate, I didn't really, I had not been given by my introduction to education as an architect, a process for generative capacity for things of a consequential nature, because it wasn't part of the discussion. So I had the tools, right, but I had to kind of create the terrain. So that's kind of been the process from then to now. So actually, now that we have, let me tell the story. So Julie and I had been separated, and I was at a drawing studio. It was in a basement. Now Julie and I had met previously in the same person's drawing studio, but it was in a building across the street. I had this huge Gray's Anatomy book because, being an architect, I had to understand how everything got put together. And Julie, being an artist, she kind of thought that was really silly, which it was. Anyway, I had kind of sat next to this really beautiful girl, and she was really cute, and she was really talented. And I was like, I need to talk to her. And I kept looking. I was like, I got 3 hours. I got this. So in 3 hours, I could not find a way to figure out anything to say. So now, kind of like crestfallen and kind of sad, I kind of thought, no, man, I missed this opportunity. So Julie said, like, oh, you carry that huge Gray's Anatomy book with you all over the place. So she gives me the opportunity to talk to her. Now it catches me off guard, and I freak out. Now, again, I was like covered in head to toe in dust. I had been doing layout for some cabinet work.
Yummy.
And, it was like, I had like my Stabila level, which I still have, which I love. And
Your
like
size
my size
46
46 army pants. Yeah. Cause I had like tons of pockets, and, I'm kind of like,
you could fit a Chinese family of 5 in those.
I used to, because they actually paid extra rent. So anyway, as a result, Julie asked me this. I'm freaked out, and I kind of like grab the thing, run out, and I'm like, well done, Bruce. Anyway, fast forward about a year, and I'm waiting for my ex-wife to pick up my son, who is with us, because I used to go to his nursery school, pick him up, and then wait for my ex-wife to pick him up to take him home to her house. And I'm at the drawing studio, and she's late. Now I told her, look, drawing starts at 6. You need to get them at 5:30 because I need time. Like these people, don't want to have a child around. Anyway, Julie, who's not a big fan of children,
No, I'm
right, kind of saw as it got to be like 10 to 6, 5 to 6, 2 to 6, 6 o'clock,
Yeah.
and she hasn't shown up, like, kind of like says, oh my goodness, what's going
I
on?
felt so bad.
She felt bad for me. Now, Julie is the most generous, compassionate, considerate person that you'll ever meet.
Well, thank you.
But she kind of took pity on me again. So she comes over, and I think I had my level, and I kind of like still was wearing the same pants. I had some of the same dust on me, even though it was a year later. And she starts talking to Cameron and instantly engages him and calms him down and diffuse the situation, because all these kind of like people who were poor draftspeople who kind of like,
They were so intolerant.
they were so intolerant. It was so funny. Now I could see if they kind of drew like Raphael, it'd be understandable. But I mean,
Hardly.
most of these people drew like, I don't know, they couldn't draw flies, which is a kind of saying I have, I think is funny. So anyway, that was where I met Julie. And then our first date was at the Greek Gold Show at the Metropolitan Museum that
It
weekend.
was.
And the rest is architectural and art history, right?
Yes, it is.
Yes, it is. So that was bringing us up to the beginning in detail. We'll circle back and kind of talk more about these things in detail, but that's just kind of like the case of where it was. So now the architectural world is starting to engage again, starting to get big again, starting to go back to some of these impulses that I've had and really enjoyed, the things that kind of got me out there. But what I had to realize was that, like, it wasn't going to happen in a very stifling environment that was not creative and not engaging. And it wasn't a terrible environment. It was just not an environment that was conducive to the things that I felt were important. And I think one of the things that's important to understand is it's perfectly reasonable to kind of say that, okay, guys, look, you do what you do, and I'll do what I do, and we'll go our separate ways. And I don't think it was a terrible thing. And I think one of the things that might be a good lesson here is that in the case of you finding yourself, or an individual finding themselves in that circumstance, at least I would encourage you that for me, it was the right choice. And that being able to investigate what I thought was worth investigating on my own terms turned out to be, for me, what was the best approach. And, I think also what made it easier was having a colleague like Julie, who, understands and appreciates the value of what that entails, so that was
You can't be with a conventional thinker.
no, I don't think I can. I think one of the things that I realized was that, this is another quick aside, is that I understood the idea of educated and erudite individuals, but I didn't understand that what seemed to be happening to me was I needed to have someone who had the same adventurous imagination that I had, and I think that was kind of something that has been borne out over time, that initial impulse to kind of, go into that labyrinth of ideas and kind of the labyrinth of imagination, and just kind of not want to ever leave and just live there 24 hours a day, 7 days a week till, there's no time left, was all I ever wanted to do. It has been, I don't say it's for everyone, but it's for me. So let's
Everyone
see.
can't handle it.
Yeah, they might. I don't know. I mean, I don't want to judge other people. I just know this is what's right for me.
I'm very keen on judging other people.
Yes, you are. Yes, you are. Anyway, so that's it for now. Next week is going to be indicators of societal health, which is kind of like going back to something we've talked about in the past, but it's more in terms of like defining that. And then after that will be emotional attachments to ideas, which is kind of an indicator of something else, which is, again, what I would call kind of like societally unhealthy. So this has been The Realm of Ideas is Free to All. And as we say, in the realm of ideas is free to all, and it's to the benefit of all for us to maintain it just like this. Thank you.
Nicely done.